First part of Numbers today. As I had talked about when we initially looked into this, Leviticus 17 to 26 is called the Holiness Code. All right, there's the Covenant Code, which is in chapters 21 to 23 of Exodus. For those of you who are hearing this on tape, this is the first Wednesday of the month when we always have our air raid siren, and that's going off. It has nothing to do with someone being hauled off via ambulance here to some sort of special facility. And I'd like to think again with you. And of course, we have another major section of material in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy actually 5 to 11 and 12 to 26 plus 28, which is also another major set of laws, instructions that people would have. And there are a few little places in Numbers where there are some instructions as well. Remember, first of all, that what we have is we have God selecting the people, choosing them. Some people would say that you have a special new relationship with the people after God brings them out of Egypt. I don't know why, but I have never been drug in that direction. I have always seen that Abraham and his family are the initial part of that covenant, as they are asked to leave southern Iraq and then asked to leave Syria and go to the land of promise. And because of the thing of God says, I promised you people that I would bring you out of Egypt and back to the land, and that's in Genesis 15 already, that the wickedness of the people has not been completed. So there is a sense in which I think there is simply one covenant that goes all the way through this business, rather than a separate agreement with different individuals. One of the differences, though, is we don't have anything in the material about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and his brothers about any, quote, 10 commandments, 10 words. And so some people would say that the covenant with Abraham was one-sided, that it was a covenant where God simply made his promise and Abram went, which I think is the big deal. God calls him to go somewhere and he goes. But you certainly don't have the kind of thing that's going to get into a lot of very specific ways to live out that relationship. I've tried to make the point, and to me it's very essential that we look at these as, where we look at what is the motivation for why people are called to do something, and that the motivation itself is part of the issue. And here we get into different ideas about human nature. So there are some people, in fact, this is why it's hard to be a teacher. It's why it's hard to be a boss. Because not everybody gets motivated the same way. All right, whenever I hear, and I don't know which of you were public school teachers, but whenever I hear somebody say, well, the teachers would do a better job in the school system if we gave them better pay. I want to give people an earned living, but if it's only going to be, if you give me more money, then I'll work harder, my answer is fire you right now. Okay? Because if your only motivation is money and not the children that you're trying to teach, then we can give you a double salary, and you're still going to find some way to be lazy. When I used to think about getting people to come and teach at Concordia, the real issue is, can you tell when they're being interviewed what kind of teacher they're going to be? And if you get a good one, you don't have to ever motivate them again. You might check on them, you might see how are they doing, but basically you don't need to say, well, I'll give you more money if you do this, or I'll give you more money because you do this. Certainly there are levels of ability that we can have, but if somebody is always wandering around complaining about the administration, they're going to be a problem all the way through. If somebody says, well, I'm going to just do my job, I got enough to do, then that's going to be a different kind of a deal. And it gets at us in life. We get motivated, and I've talked about this with teleology, where we get motivated either by reward or punishment. And so if somebody says, well, you have to be to work at 6 a.m., and if you're not here at 6 a.m., you're fired, and you get there at 2 minutes after, and they say, I'm sorry, there's the door, there's a bigger problem. Who knows what happens when you get caught in ice storms or something like that. Now, there are some jobs where you have to be there on time. Okay, there are some jobs where if you're an air traffic controller, they don't leave the place empty for an hour. All right, so somebody has to stay late if you don't get there. But when we look at the motivation here, there are different ways in which people are going to analyze the motivation and the way in which these commandments were put forth. Remember that the word command in Hebrew is from the word mitzvah, like our bar mitzvah. There are innumerable books written by Jewish scholars and studied and analyzed by Christian scholars as well about every one of these laws. None of them has all the answers. Every time you get a law, you say, well, what about? What about this? What if this happens? What if that happens? Judaism, after the exile, after 586, actually after 540, when they came back from exile, began to try to say, what exactly does God mean by these things? So, you shall have no other gods. Okay, you might say, well, that's a pretty easy one. You shall not make a graven image. So does that mean that the Eastern Orthodox Christians who have pictures of Mary or pictures of the saints are breaking God's laws? Some people would have said yes. There's something called the iconoclastic controversy. We know the word icon now, but the icons go way, way back. And they would say these are simply like our picture books, like our Sunday school leaflets that we would have, that would give us a picture of what something looks like, maybe Elijah against the prophets of Baal or something like that. Well, there were churches where they smashed those all up. And they said we can't have any pictures of anything like that at all. There would be pictures or there would be places, churches, where they would say we can't have any altars. So you may have been in certain kinds of Protestant denominations where they don't have an altar, because they would say altars are part of sacrifice. Jesus died for our sins, so we can't have an altar. And all sorts of other things that Christians as well have tried to think through. In Judaism, they had something that they called putting a fence around the law. And by that, what they meant was, let's think of all the possibilities and think of how we make sure we don't go against God in this way. In other words, God almost becomes the enemy who is going to spank you if you step out of line just a little bit. So make sure you don't get anywhere near the edge. So we'll have that you should not make a fire on the Sabbath day, nor should you put a fire out. Easier to let one die out than to start one, but you're not even supposed to put a fire out. That's what then leads into things like Sabbath elevators, because you can't make any sort of electrical connection. Kathy and I have never used it, but we have a Sabbath feature on our range, on our oven, where we can set it so that it will go on its own and go off on its own. If we were Jewish, then we would be able to put something in maybe at Friday evening and have it ready on Saturday night, where we wouldn't have touched a button. So as long as you don't touch the button, you're okay. And so the question becomes, what's our relationship with God, and how do we honor him with what we do? Now, one of the problems in understanding how Judaism understood these laws is that at the time of Jesus, they were all oral. They said, we don't write anything down. We keep all these in our mind. We pass them on orally. That's part of what would have happened in synagogues. And so they wouldn't write them down. They didn't begin writing them down until the time after the temple had been destroyed, and they said, we better preserve a record of this for people who may be part of a different community than we are. And so most of the Jewish traditions are from in the hundreds or maybe the 200s, when they would have written down a lot of these things. And so we have words like the Mishnah and the Talmud and other things that would be lists of those. But the Jewish people have like a whole book on nidah, on vowels, on vows. Okay, so all the different kind of vows that you could make. When would you make it? How would you do it? What would happen if you had to break it? And all of those kinds of things. And another one that would be on the Sabbath, and another one that would be about marriage. And so every major area. How many laws do the Jewish people usually identify as in the books of Moses? Nobody know this one? 613. So I can't do the math in my head. I've never tried to learn it, but 365 of them are you shall not. And the other, whatever that number is, are you shall. So there are some things to stay away from, and there are some things to do. Now, what's the motivation for all of this? That's where it gets tricky. That's where Christians have a lot of differences of opinion with each other. How do you, quote, get someone to do what God wants you to do? How do you motivate people to do what they, quote, ought to be doing, what they should be doing, what they're supposed to be doing because it's in the Bible? Dale?
If you don't do it, you're dead.
That's the motivation?
Well, for some people.
So-
Someone didn't go on the mountain.
So what if you do it then?
You die. You get one chance.
You know what the trouble is with that? Adam and Eve didn't die when they took the fruit of the tree. So they would say, well, yeah, but it may be delayed a little bit. Sometimes it was right away. Sometimes you're right, they got zapped and that was it. So sometimes humans would punish. Sometimes God would do it. And so the idea is you can never get away from God. So if you don't get it here, you'll get it there. And so you can threaten people with, you're going to go to hell if you do this. In fact, there were a lot of preachers back in the late 1800s, the old hellfire and damnation preaching. You want to go to hell? Then you keep on doing what you're doing. And so the motivation is not let the love of Christ move you to act, but you better be afraid of God. In fact, I don't know, I think it was within the, there's a name of American History magazine where I read an article in there once where a lot of the Old Testament stories were in the public school readers back in the 1800s as motivation for ethics. You see what God did to them when they turned away? You want that to happen to you? Then go ahead and do the same thing. I hope I don't step over the line when I say this, but I remember hearing that a lot of the good citizenship in our country was because of the black Baptist grandmas who would say to their grandkids, don't you dare, or guess what's going to happen. We don't have many of them around, I guess, anymore because they can't motivate as much. When you don't have the church motivating, and that was one of the reasons that the church was given its ability to have worship, because they keep people in line. You don't need as many cops that way. If the church can scare you into being straight living, then you don't need police to try and catch you and lock you up. Now, we may say, oh, that's terrible, but that really is the way a lot of times we think. Maybe we can give them a little religion. Maybe we can scare them straight a little bit. We know it doesn't work, but we would like to think it does. So I talked about with teleology, that it's if then. If you do this, then you get the reward. But that's only part of the story. I also talked about ontology, where because you are in Christ, therefore this will happen as a result. Now, there are times when you have if and then in the Bible. And so people would say, well, that must be teleology. That must be reward and punishment stuff. But it's also a possibility to talk about if and then when you're in the relationship. So if I say something like, if a husband and wife each figure out what they are good at and where they can make a contribution to the family and to the marriage, and if they're able to do that, then things ought to go well. And it's not like there's going to be a 50% this or that. There may be one does everything in a certain area and one does something else. So maybe I do most of the stuff with the finances and the books, and Kathy does all the stuff with the cooking and the baking and the meal preparation. So it doesn't mean we're going to say, well, everybody's going to do everything just even, but you find out what your unique gifts and abilities are, and you go through with that. Now, I can say within a marriage, if you continue to do these things, then your marriage will go well. Now, that's not an if you do it, then you get something, but because you already have the relationship, if you keep on that track, then you will find joy in the relationship. And so when we look at these laws, there are sometimes where people don't know, why was that law there? Sometimes the Jewish people guess, God just said, we're just going to give you a random one here, and just find out, are you going to just do it because we said it or not? But it would be, if I follow that and if I understand it, that I'm really honoring the Lord. To say, I honor you with what I do. Now, I think it is fair, and this is part of the discussion that we've had a little bit about stewardship. I think it's fair to give people an opportunity to bind themselves to some things. So making a promise. I promise the Lord that I'm going to provide from what He's given me for the work of our congregation so much per week. I would bind myself to that. I bind myself to at least a half hour of exercise every day, whether I need it or not. And there are days when it's very hard. Days when it gets done like today at 6:30 or 7 in the morning. Days when it gets done at 10:30 at night. And it's sort of like, I agreed with a doctor who said, I want you to get some exercise every day. And I don't call him up on the phone every day. He probably doesn't remember who I am. At least he wouldn't remember my name probably. But he said this would be healthy for you. And so what we have here, whether we can guess at all the reasons, is that God says this is a healthy way for you to live. To recognize that I'm the one who gives life, to recognize the barriers and borders that you have. In other words, you don't take the tree of life, and you don't take the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. 10 commandments are really like 10 trees in the garden. 10 trees in the garden, outside the garden. Okay? Don't take this, don't take this. Use this, use this. God said, go enjoy the garden. Just don't take those two. Now, we might say, yes, but they wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. God says, I don't want you to know good and evil. I want you to just know good. And so these may not be things that people in the other nations would have done. It may be things where God says through Moses, don't do this because other nations were doing things differently. Other nations were worshiping their multitude of gods that didn't exist, but that they would have thought did. And so to try and hear that this is in no way God trying to be mean. A lot of it is a commentary on love me above all things and love your neighbor as yourself. So a lot of it would be just, how do you take care of your body? What do you do if there are diseases floating around? What do you do about taking care of your property and the property of other people? So I have no idea how far I will get with this, but I'm going to read at least for a little bit for this first hour from some of the material in Leviticus. So I'm going to just start with Leviticus 17, and we'll just monkey around with a little bit of this. The Lord spoke to Moses, Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the people of Israel and say to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. If anyone of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or slaughters it outside the camp and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, he shall be guilty of bloodshed. He has shed blood, and he shall be cut off from the people. That doesn't sound like a very pleasant solution. Why not? Why would this law be there? Pardon?
For the benefit of the group.
Yeah, but why for the benefit of the group? Who cares? I mean, we probably don't have this going on in all the slaughterhouses in our country. We certainly don't. They aren't all in churches. But there was a deep, deep understanding that the life is in the blood. And that if you are taking an animal, you offer that animal actually to God. You offer to God this animal. Now, it doesn't say here you can't slaughter the animal. But God would say, I don't want you using that blood for yourself. I don't want you consuming it thinking that it will give you extra power or life or strength. It's sort of like the steroids of the day. Probably didn't work, but that's what they would have been thinking, that you can load up with a little bit extra life and you can be stronger and more powerful. You can be Goliath instead of David. And so a lot of this was respect for life. Remember the tree of life in the midst of the garden. So at least what you are doing is you are acknowledging God gave this animal life, and we are using this animal now, this sacrifice, that which is being slaughtered, but we are doing it by acknowledging what he has done. This is true in many, many cultures. In Paul's day, the Corinthians write and says, what about meat offered to idols? Well, the butcher shop and the temple were next door to each other, if not the same building. And so people in other cultures have acknowledged that there's a mystery in the life of every animal, and so they would give that honor back to God and then use the rest of it. And so that goes on many, many times. This is in order that the people of Israel may bring their sacrifices that they offer in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord, to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to the Lord. The priest shall dash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord, because they used to also eat the fat, which doesn't sound good to me at all, and try and get extra strength that way too. So offer it up to God. So in other words, God's given you as much strength as you're going to get. Don't try and take the fat and the blood and think that you can one-up God. So it's nothing to do really with the fat and the blood. It's to do with he's the Lord and you're not. Okay, so don't try and play equal with God using things he created as if you are in charge of them. You can see where this would go with abortion. Okay, who do you think you are to take life away from one that is growing in a womb? Because it's my body. And I've had people get very angry with me, and people who have been disgusted with me for saying that. People who will come up with a different idea that why should people have the children where they can't do a good job of raising them anyway? It's better just to abort them instead of give them a rotten life. I've had people, members of congregations, who have said that to me. There was one time where I had somebody who was angry with me because I said too much, and from the same congregation, someone angry with me because I said too little. How are you going to do it? So as long as we don't talk about our life today, it's okay to preach whatever I want. So the priest shall dash the blood against the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord, so that they may no longer offer their sacrifices for goat demons. Okay, so there were other demons, other powers that they used to offer to. You bring it here, then we know what you're doing with it. This shall be a statute forever to them throughout their generations. And say to them further, anyone of the house of Israel or of the aliens who reside among them, who offer a burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to sacrifice it to the Lord, shall be cut off from the people. That sounds like an instant replay of what we just heard. I don't know why it's there. If anyone of the house of Israel or of the aliens who reside among them eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut that person off from the people. I've read a good number of commentaries and all this stuff, and I think they're still not sure whether that means you get kicked out of the camp or if you get killed. And there are some things where one happens and one where the other happens, but cut off from the people can be in both senses. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you for making atonement for your lives on the altar. For as life, it is blood that makes atonement at one mint. So we're acknowledging in a whole burnt offering that animal dies before God instead of me. And so if I do something wrong, this would be the way, not always, but this would be the way, if I acknowledge it, that I would be able to have oneness with God again. So Dale, this would be kind of the, if I've done something I should die for, an animal dies instead of me. How that all goes on and where that all comes from, and the fact that it's used in the New Testament of how Jesus dies for us. If I understand it correctly, nobody knows quite how far back this goes, that you offer something instead of yourself. But it's sort of like a way to buy yourself off. Now, the expectation is that you're really sorry. That for what you have done, you are sorry for what you have done, and not just going through the motions. One of these, sorry, that's a good way to let me know you're not. Therefore, I have said to the people of Israel, no person among you shall eat blood, nor shall any alien who resides among you eat blood. And any one of the people of Israel or of the aliens who reside among them who hunts down an animal or bird that it may be eaten shall pour out its blood and cover it with earth. So if you do kill an animal way far away, you pour out the blood. I don't know how much, Kathy, you remember about this, but our member Al Politz raised chickens and sold them at the Western market. And so he would butcher most of them and take them to the Western market. But he always took a few live chickens. Why? For the Jewish people. They said, Al, we know that you're doing the right job and you're draining the blood out, but we've got to do it. We've got to know we're doing this right before God. So he always had to take some live chickens in there as well that they would be able to buy from him, which was convenient when we had chickens and Al came over to help butcher them for us. That he knew what he was doing. One of us did. For the life of every creature, its blood is its life. Therefore I have said to the people of Israel, you shall not eat the blood of any creature. For the life of every creature is its blood. Whoever eats it shall be cut off. All persons, citizens, or aliens who eat what dies of itself or what has been torn by animals shall wash their clothes and bathe themselves with water and be unclean until evening. Then they shall be clean. We call that roadkill. But if they do not wash themselves or bathe their body, they shall bear their guilt. So that's chapter 17. A whole chapter just about blood. All right, we'll see some more of that along the way as well. Chapter 18. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes. My ordinances you shall observe. My statutes you shall keep, following them. I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances. By doing so one shall live. I am the Lord. Is that teleological or ontological? Is it an if-then statement? If you do it, then this happens? Or because you are this, this is what happens? It's the second one. It's the second one. Because it says like 80 million times, I'm the Lord your God. Okay, so here's what the relationship is all about. Here's what it means that I'm the Lord your God. Don't go looking around at what other peoples do and say, let's be like they are. But rather, find out, what did I do, what am I doing, and how am I giving you counsel? None of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or born abroad. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter, or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, begotten by your father, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, for she is your father's flesh. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's flesh. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. That is, you shall not approach his wife, she is your aunt. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law, she is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, and you shall not take her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter to uncover her nakedness. They are your flesh. It is depravity. And you shall not take a woman as a rival to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanness. You shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her. You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch, and so to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. All of that stuff was going on. He says, it may go on out in the world. It's not to go on among you, because I chose you. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, for by all these practices the nations I am casting out before you have defiled themselves. Thus the land became defiled, and I punished it for its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. But you shall keep my statutes, my ordinances, and commit none of these abominations, either the citizen or the alien who resides among you, for the inhabitants of the land who were before you committed all these abominations, and the land became defiled. Otherwise, the land will vomit you out for defiling it, as it vomited out the nation that was before you. For whoever commits any of these abominations shall be cut off from the people. So keep my charge not to commit any of these abominations that were done before you, and not to defile yourselves by them. I am the Lord your God. It says it over and over and over again. I'm the Lord your God. This doesn't fit. So, chapter 18. So, all of these different family relationships and relationships outside of a man and woman marriage are all listed here. Chapter 19. This one you might recognize a little bit somewhere along the line, I think, maybe, possibly. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Ever heard that before? Now, is that teleological or ontological? Is that if then or because therefore?
First one, because therefore.
Second was the because therefore. Okay. Is it if you do this, then I'll love you, or because I love you, do this?
The first one, because I love you, do this.
That's the second one. That's twice I gave you the second one. You said that's the first one. We may be here a long time today with that. I am the Lord your God. I mean, that's the theme all the way through. Now let's talk about life inside this relationship. How many laws and ordinances were in the Garden of Eden? Don't touch that fruit.
Just two.
Just don't take the fruit of the tree. Okay? These are things where, as a result of the fall into sin, people have come up with other ways of thinking and acting. And here what he's saying is, there are people who think this way. Don't be among them. All right? And so if I associate with people who think that way, I'm gradually going to be moving away from the relationship that God has established for me. So he says, this is the way I have promised I will bless you. that I will be with you. And you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. You're going to be as set apart as I am. That's what the holiness code is all about. Set apart for God's purpose. That's what we call sanctification. Setting things apart for God's purpose. Any of you ever been sanctified?
Baptized.
Yeah, you got baptized. That's good enough. In the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. You got set apart to be on this earth to honor and serve the Lord with your life. To find out what would go against it and to say, Lord, keep me from those things. Spoil in me the lust of sinning. You shall each revere your mother and father. You shall keep my Sabbaths. I am the Lord your God. Now, do not turn to idols or make cast images for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. Now look at that. Revere your mother and father. Number? In the Lutheran count? 4. Catholic count 5. No, Catholic count is 4 too. It's the other Protestants that would have that as 5. But you shall revere your father and mother, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. Do you remember which 2 of the 10 words have an imperative? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. All the other 8 are, this is not to be so among you. He just bashes away here and says, well, I happen to remember that from the last book. Those are things you set aside. Now, do you have to go to church to be a Christian?
No.
Huh? What? Do you have to go to church to be a Christian? Kathy, they all are suspicious of me. How can this be? How can this be that they are suspicious?
They're all true.
It's hard to go to church, but you are the church. Do you have to be part of the church to be a Christian? Yeah. Because the church is the body of Christ. So whether you act on that in certain ways, that's going to be different. I might be Baptist and go 3 times every day on Sunday. Okay? I might think, well, I got to be a Seventh-day Adventist and go to church on the Sabbath day because that's the day God set aside for us. I might say, well, as long as I think about maybe going to church, that's good enough. So now you can get church on TV. I had a member once in Michigan where for some reasons that he didn't get along with a couple of people at the church about some issues. He dropped his wife off and then went home to TV church. And he later came back after 29 years. He's a good man. He came back. He had a wonderful singing voice that he had been missing out on. But it took 7 years that I was there before we sat down and got to have the kind of talk where he came back. But he couldn't tell me the gospel after 29 years of TV church. I didn't push him real hard on it, but he wasn't able to say, Jesus is my Lord and Savior. He went to church on TV every Sunday, but he wasn't part of a community. And so I have done untold private communions for people who can't get to church. I'm not going to say to them, you're not a Christian anymore because you're not in church on Sunday, or you're not singing in the choir or taking care of the altar guild or something like that. But if I say I don't need to, then it's a different kind of deal. I can be a Christian all by myself. The Holy Spirit says in the New Testament, do not forsake the gathering together as some have, to the harm of their souls. And so I do know that if someone's not hearing the good news, that's not good. Which also means if they come to worship, they better be hearing good news. And not just a speech about let's all be nice to each other. You can get that in the park on the 4th of July. But that Christ died and rose. And I was down in Dallas, mentioned this trip that I took to go to an ordination service. And so of all things, and I know who he is, and I've known from the past, but the professor of homiletics, of preaching at the St. Louis Seminary preached. And he had a good sermon. I enjoyed it very much, but I came up afterwards and I said, yep, I would always say to every one of my students, if Jesus didn't have to die and rise for your sermon, you didn't preach one. If you can just give a nice speech about some part of the Bible and you don't have to mention Jesus' death and resurrection, you didn't tell any good news. The good news is he's done something to change our heart from what it is by nature to what it is by grace. And that story never gets old. At least not for me. If I come to church and I don't hear that, then let's fire the preacher. I haven't fired him yet, by the way, but there's always the chance. So, because we're here because someone has brought us from death to life. Well, in the Old Testament, it wasn't quite so strange, but they got brought from Egypt into the land of Canaan, or they were being brought there on the way right now. And so these instructions are coming to them to say, you have been separated out. Now live as separated, set apart people. That doesn't mean we can convince all Christians about that. And there are going to be people who say, I'm a good Christian. By the way, there aren't any good Christians. They're just Christians. Because if there's good Christians, then there's bad ones. There's just Christians. Okay? Good and bad is morality, is religion. That's not in the Christian faith. People who are dead and alive. By the way, how many religions are there in the world, do you think? How many would you guess? 2. People who are alive in Christ forever and everybody else. What names they give to all those other outfits, they're all finally either inside that relationship or not. And if they're not, our job is to love them in and to find them where they are and help them to hear the good news. Because then their heart gets settled. So we get this idea, oh my goodness, all those religions, and they must all have some good in them. No, they don't. No, they don't. They're just different ways of trying to make it through life without an almighty God who comes into the flesh to suffer and die and rise. Now, the Jewish people did not know that yet. They didn't have clarity about Jesus coming to die and rise. It's not in our texts here. It doesn't say in Leviticus 19, by the way, Jesus is going to come and be killed by Pontius Pilate in 1,300 years and going to take you to be with him in heaven. But God does give the relationship of how he makes peace with them through his love and care for them, sinners and small though they may be. That doesn't mean there aren't some who die in the process because they turn away. One of the hardest things to get across that I had when I was teaching the prophets, the prophetic literature, was to say, not every word in the prophets is directed toward me. If it says, you have left the relationship, you have abandoned God, I haven't. And so I ought not think that God is going to punish me and zap me and send me to hell because I wasn't paying attention during the Lord's Prayer last week. Those who have left say, nuts to that. I don't believe in that stuff anymore. I've moved beyond that. And that's where a lot of the people of the days of the prophets, that's where they were in the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ, the 6th century before Christ. They had left. And God says, the consequences of that come upon you because you're drawing away the ones whom I love. You're getting in the way of them staying faithful. So it wasn't that God rejoiced in anybody who left, but at a certain point he said, I'm not going to let everybody get lost because of that. Just like Jesus says, if I let things get bad enough on the earth, everybody will deny the faith. So I'm going to be with you, and I'm not going to let that happen. So when you sacrifice, verse 5, when you offer a sacrifice of well-being to the Lord, offer it in such a way that it is acceptable in your behalf. It shall be eaten on the same day you offer it, or on the next day, and anything left over until the third day shall be consumed in fire. If it's eaten at all on the third day, it's an abomination. It will not be acceptable. That word abomination is sort of like yuck. Over and over, to'eva is the Hebrew word for it, just says, bleh. That's not to happen. Don't do this. Well, it may be just the wisdom of God who knew science back then already, who says, food can spoil. And there are some things where we're not sure exactly why all that comes in, but it may be just this spoiled or that would spoil. Verse 8. And all who eat it shall be subject to punishment because they have profaned what is holy to the Lord, and any such person shall be cut off from the people. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap it to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. And you shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of the Lord, the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not defraud your neighbor. You shall not steal. You shall not keep for yourself the wages of a laborer until morning. You shall not revile the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people, and you shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. You shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. You shall reprove your neighbor, or you will incur guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And there's the key little thing that everything spins around in this whole section. Remember when Jesus asked the rich young man and the lawyer, what are the two greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So this basically says, now when Jesus does this, he kicks it up a little bit. You know this is called the golden rule, right? Love your neighbor, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus kicks that up a little bit in the last chapters of John where he is in the upper room. He says, love one another as I have loved you. Okay? So it's not just do unto others what you would have them do unto you, but do unto others what I've already done to you. I have given my life, I have died, I've risen, I've given you, or he would very soon, I have given you everything. Love them as people for whom I died. Now, that means that we're going to get in a lot of situations where people are going to be mean and unkind to us, and the best at least we can do is not slap them back in the face. Okay, there are going to be people who are going to be irritated by who we are no matter how hard we try. But love your neighbor as yourself. We're all going to love ourselves more than we love our neighbor because we're just around ourselves more. Okay, there's no way in which I can be just caring about somebody else as much. But think of them in the same way that you take care of yourself. When I taught out at Oak Park Heights in the maximum security prison, I said one day, now what should happen to the purse of an 85-year-old lady who's got $100,000 in her purse and she leaves it in the grocery cart to go get a box of crackers? Now what's the answer? The 6-letter word, nothing. Nothing. It's hers, leave it alone. Now, a couple of them came up with this standard line, well, if she's dumb enough to, No, it's hers. You take care of it. And so, technically, you help your neighbor get his donkey out of the hole, and he'll help you. But you do it because you're honoring the Lord, who gave you yours and him his. All right? And so, the response, that's really what ontology is all about. This is what I've been given. Now, how do I respond with respect to the Lord? Not out of getting smacked in the face, but out of the joy of knowing and seeing that it's all being taken care of. So really, it's not just what is the rule or law, but what has happened first of all. So if people aren't living a Christian life, they need to hear the good news more, not more laws. They haven't taken into account what that might be, and nobody has taken it into account completely. There are all sorts of times when we have, quote, walked by on the other side and given good reason why we're not going to help somebody right now. Nobody is ever going to be able to do that completely. And so sins of omission, we're always going to offer to the Lord, I'm not everything you want me to be. But this idea is that love your neighbor as yourself. It just all of a sudden comes popping in there. Not even a whole verse, but verse 19, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your animals breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor shall you put on a garment made of two different materials. I think that from Jacob Milgram's book on this, I think what it says is, and from the Exodus commentary that I read through a few years ago, that God says that which is the prettiest with the multiple colors and all of that, that goes into the tabernacle. That's where that special is. Otherwise, just keep things separate. Now, that's one interpretation. Remember, every interpretation of the Bible, we're in guess land. Just we can maybe have more educated guesses or not. But as soon as I try and say, here's why, he just says don't do it. So if I say, why? Why can't I do that? Well, then I may be pushing in a direction where I'm not going to come up with a good answer. May not come up with God's answer. And so a lot of times the trouble we get into with the Bible is when we say, well, why not? Instead of just saying, hey, he says do it, do it. Well, why? My mother used to talk about how many times I would say, why? Why this? Why that? Why this? Why that? If a man has sexual relations with a woman who is a slave, designated for another man, but not ransomed or given her freedom, an inquiry shall be held. They shall not be put to death, since she has not been freed, but he shall bring a guilt offering for himself to the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, a ram as a guilt offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord for his sin that he committed, and the sin he committed shall be forgiven him. Just a brief comment here. This comment could go 100 different times, 100 different ways. Men and women are not treated equally in the Bible. Okay? Just, that's the way it is. Women were considered part of a family, and so here you have slave girls. Why would you have a slave girl? Well, there may be a dad who owes money to his neighbor, and he can't pay it. So he says, well, you can have my daughter's services for 6 years, and she can take care of your sheep and your goats and whatever, whatever the case may be. Slave girls are not on the same level even with girls of free men. There's all sorts of stuff that we're irritated about, that we say, well, why is this way, and why isn't it different? It's why so many people toss the Old Testament out. Because they say it doesn't meet with our standard of morality. Of course, we have lakes named after people like Calhoun, where somebody wants to throw it out and come up with a name I can't pronounce. I got to start some new languages, I guess, some Native American languages. So we're going to have places where people are going to look in one age and say, that was a bad age. So why should I listen to anything in it? It may not be the right way to say it, but this was at least more humane than what would have been done otherwise. So sometimes this is more humane than it could have been. But I can't justify all of this. I have been infuriated at the number of commentaries that I have read where they have simply said, this is rotten morality and this is terrible and I sure wouldn't follow this in the Bible, and why should we even read that? What do you do in a commentary if all you can do is find fault? So at a minimum, it seems that God is being more gracious. He sets some boundaries in terms of sexual activities. He sets some where, in essence, he can say, okay, you take her as wife then, or that you are not killed for what you have done. When you come into the land and plant all kind of trees for food, then you shall regard their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you, it must not be eaten. In the 4th year, all the fruit must be set apart for rejoicing in the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat of their fruit, that their yield may be increased for you. I am the Lord your God. Now, why does he say stay away?
Let the tree grow.
Let the tree grow. Let it just go on its own. Don't pick the fruit off. And by the 5th year, it'll be a good producer. So the 4th year, rejoice that God has still kept it alive. That their yield may be increased for you. So he gives a reason here. Well, let me tell you why. Because of this. You shall not eat anything with its blood. You shall not practice augury or witchcraft. You shall not round off the hair on your temples or mar the edges of your beard. You shall not make any gashes in your flesh for the dead or tattoo any marks upon you. I am the Lord. Do not profane your daughter. By the way, this last one here with the rounding off the temples, not cutting off the hair. The Orthodox Jews, particularly in Israel, you'll see they've got these real long pigtail type of things because they follow that. So every single thing here, people have listened to very carefully and said, how are we going to act on it? Some people are going to say, we're going to try and do every single thing. Some say, we'll do some, and others are just time-bound to another era. And some say, that was then, this is now. So you have Orthodox and conservative and Reform Judaism. There are the conservatives and the moderates and the liberals in every church body. They may not have such a wide range, but there's some within every one of different ways of looking at things, and they'll at least be pushing the edge of, why don't we let this happen? Could priests ever be married in the church?
Yes.
Till about 1000 AD. And then the church said, if they have kids, they're going to be dividing up all those lands with their kids. We'd rather keep them all for ourselves. Great hue and cry. Boy, the priests didn't like that. Happened anyway. Do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, that the land not become prostituted and full of depravity. Realize every single one of these things means it was happening somewhere. Okay? We probably don't have many places where in the Bible where it says, breathe oxygen. Okay? That's doing what comes naturally. Most of us know we're supposed to drink water and eat and take nourishment and things like this. The things that are here usually are there because somebody was doing the opposite, and in essence God says, don't go over that boundary. Don't go over there. Don't do this. Stay away from that. Because they were doing those things. A guy who wants to make money by making his daughter a prostitute, God says, don't. Now, he doesn't say, there's probably 3 good reasons why not to. He just says, don't. And so sometimes you have casuistic law, which is a case-by-case law. So if somebody has killed somebody, and they were good buddies, and there was an accident, that's different than if one guy was laying for the other one. So you've got murder and manslaughter and things like that in some of these laws around here. But some of them are called apodictic. Apodikeo means simply speak against it, and you don't have to come up with any reasons why. So the 10 words, in essence, are all apodictic. Okay, it doesn't come up with, well, but lying is okay if this happens or that happens. So what happens if you're a family that's hiding a Jew during the Second World War, and you say, no, I'm not hiding anybody? How do you deal with that? You shall not lie. Well, sometimes people would say for the greater good. Used to be these crazy ethics tests where they give you is it okay to steal a pencil from work to give to an underprivileged child? The reality is, why don't you buy a pencil for the kid and give it to him? Why do you have to steal that? And there was this one test in the ethics class that I used to teach where they gave different groups different scenarios, and they were to collect on a screen to see what everybody thought. And some people thought this is, A1 was just a horrible thing, and somebody else picked A1 as the best thing. And finally they got the idea, we don't all have the same questions. But the title of it was, Where Do You Draw the Line? And a religion of rules, how does it go? Always operates so that the people break the rules or the rules break the people. We don't believe in a religion, we believe in the Christian faith. And so there is a sense in which we need to honor God and do the best we can with how we live. If I'm called before a judge and have to give testimony, then I'm to give it as honorably as I can and not lie there because I'm trying to protect someone who doesn't deserve to be protected. But Luther would say, none of us live under the law, we live under the gospel. That means, in essence, we have a deeper honor to God than even just certain rules. But we're, to say, okay, you have to go to church to be a Christian. If I look at the nature of being a Christian, I would say here are things that are natural for my life as a Christian: to worship and praise, come before the Lord with singing, offer my time and talents and treasures. These are part of that new relationship, and I seek to live those out. But if it's something like, now start breathing. How many of you obeyed me? Half of you just are holding your breath now just to see what happens. You can't start breathing. You've been breathing since they give you a good whack a long time ago. And start being a Christian. No, everybody who is a Christian is living out their Christian life. Holding back on some things, living some things out. And so if you get the idea a little bit here, so I'll take a few more. Verse 29, do not profane your daughter by making her a prostitute, that the land may not be prostituted and full of depravity. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. Those two don't seem to come together very easy. Do not turn to mediums or wizards. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I'm the Lord your God. You shall rise before the aged and defer to the old, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. Kathy and I talk about this a lot. Some of you may have this same idea that people who are older or aged are not necessarily respected anymore. People will go off on their own. You shall rise before the hoary head and honor the face of the old man. I remember that from confirmation. Anybody remember that verse from Luther's Catechism from memorizing it? The hoary head was like hoarfrost, real white. So that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff. There's a few others here, that kind of stuff. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. You notice how often I am the Lord your God repeats? I don't know how many times, but it's more than one. You shall not cheat in measuring length, weight, or quantity. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall keep all my statutes and all my ordinances and observe them. I am the Lord. So let's just look generally at some of the rest of these now. Anyone who makes offerings to Moloch. Moloch may have been what they call a chthonic deity. Anybody know that word, chthonic? C-T-H-O-N-I-C or something like that. Means a deity of the underworld. So they don't only worship gods who are up above, but underworld deities. And so a fellow who got his, he taught at Seward, and then he was at River Forest. He did his doctorate at Harvard on the Moloch concept and had that as his thesis. And so Moloch, they often talk about that as down in the valley southwest of Jerusalem, where they would offer their children through fire. Don't even know whether they just threw them through the fire or burned them. Can't even know. Scholars just still aren't sure. But they passed their children through the fire to Moloch, is the way that was talked about. Mediums and wizards, all who curse their father or mother are to die. A man and an adulteress are to be put to death. They are to be burned. So it's one thing if somebody would take an unmarried slave girl. It's something different if a man takes another man's wife. And they are both to die. No sex with relatives. We've seen some of that already. The land will vomit you out. It's sort of like the land is so, it can't stand the filth of what people do on it, that it'll barf people out. That's known as exile, or that's known as God's punishment upon you. And God says, it's just got to take a break from this. Just got to take a break. Chapter 21, don't touch the dead person except those of your immediate family, the priest. is exalted, having been anointed, and priests with defects are not allowed to be able to serve. Directions for handling the sacred gifts that are brought, and lay persons are not to have that which was offered to the Lord, and offerings are to be without blemish. Don't bring that ratty, aged goat that's on its last legs and offer that in sacrifice to God, as Malachi says they were doing much later. The peace offerings as well. So you didn't just go make an offering for sin. You also made an offering where you gave the chance to say thank you to God. So you have I'm sorry and you have thank you, both as kinds of offerings that are given. Chapter 23 is a little different one. It's got all the regular festivals, and I listed those for you in that sheet that most of you probably have from last week. The Sabbath is regularly there. The Passover was in the first month, which would be in the springtime. We've got two different times of the year that begin the spring. If you lived in Iraq, the year would begin in the spring when the snow melts. If you lived in Egypt, the year would begin in the fall when the rain comes. So the beginning of the rainy season is when the year begins, but because they lived between those two countries at various times, they followed different practices of which they were under, and thus what kind of a calendar they would follow. The first fruits was at Passover, where you would grab the first of what comes. For me, that would probably be a radish that may come within about 3 weeks. So you would bring the first fruits. That was at Passover time. Paul even says Jesus is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. He's the initial down payment there. The rest will come. At Pentecost, then, which we will celebrate in our congregation here this coming Sunday, I think, right, Reverend? True. Okay, good. Got that one right. That was 7 weeks later, 7 Sabbaths later. Okay, and Pentecost would be, 50, where you would have completed first your barley harvest and then your grain harvest. Then you'd bring in the full amounts of the grains. And then in the fall of the year, you would bring in the full amounts of the grapes and the olives, or the equivalents if you sold them and then gave the money to the priest. You have one priest, or one tribe out of 12 that is kind of like the religious tribe. They also were the policemen. Okay, so the Levites, this book is called Leviticus for a reason. Okay, they were to make sure that the people followed what was there. And of course, Moses and Aaron are both from the family of the Levites, but you'd have priests and Levites, and primarily the priests were just from Aaron's family, and then the rest of them would be living somewhere around, but kind of like the constabulary or something like that in all the different towns. So they were scattered throughout the country, and they had 48 cities that they were to have, and so they were to kind of keep the peace. And then in the fall of the year, you have New Year's Day, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which is what we looked at in chapter 16, the Festival of Booths in the fall. I don't have time, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because I'm going to take the time. When Kathy and I were down in Israel in 1972, we lived in the very south of the country, in a town called, we lived at Tel Sheva, by Beersheba, which is where Abraham and Isaac lived for a while. And there was a swimming pool nearby. And so we would do our dig early in the morning. The bus would leave at 5:30 in the morning or something. We'd be done working out at the dig by about 1. We dug about 6 kilometers to the east at a place called Tel Masos. And so after we got back and had lunch and everything, we went over to the swimming pool. And walking by the swimming pool through the field was a nice vineyard. And so we had looked a little bit at how they did grapes and grapevines in Germany. And so we're just kind of walking along the edge of that. And I knew, I took 2 weeks of Arabic. You don't really learn too much in 2 weeks. Looked over my shoulder, and here's an Arab sheikh or whatever on a horse with a submachine gun across his lap. And I'm trying to say to him, we're just looking, But in the fall of the year, they would all build booths. They would all build some lean-to shelter out by their grapes or their olives so that nobody came and did a 10-finger discount at 2 o'clock in the morning. And so they would go, and during that time, which is now called the Feast of Booths, I always think of this because it sounds like booze. And you can think of the grapes, the fall harvest. This is when, Hannah would have been accused by the high priest Eli of being drunk. Why don't you go be drunk by yourself? Because she was praying, mouth moving but not voice, praying to God that she would have a child, who turns out to be Samuel. But that was the fall of the year, okay, as they would be getting the new must, the new wine and everything. So that's often when they would have weddings as well, just as before the rains were coming. And so in Isaiah 5, the Song of the Vineyard really starts out as a wedding song, and that's when they would have been by their vineyards and be harvesting their crops for the next year. Briefly, chapter 24, the sacred oil that's prepared and the sacred bread. There is a Danite who curses the name of Yahweh, and he is stoned, whether it's an alien or a citizen. This is where you kind of get this idea of you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, which is why people would just quit using it. You know, you just wouldn't say Yahweh. You'd find anything else, Adonai or Shema for name or something like that, which by the time of Jesus, they were never saying that name. So if you ever see any writings, even with the word God, from a more Orthodox Jewish writer, it'll have G and then a dash and then D. They don't put the vowel in there, just to say we will not pronounce that name. And had a little bit of quizzical things about this when I took some classes at Michigan back in the 70s, where you have some Jewish guys in there and you're reading the Hebrew text. What do you read? So read Adonai, you don't read Yahweh. And just respect for them, and you don't have to push it in their face. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Good or bad? Great improvement. Lamech smacks a kid, or smacks somebody and kills him when he only smacked him one. God says, don't go overboard punishing more than what someone has done to you. So, you know, if somebody stubbed your toe, then that's as much as you stomp on their toe, maybe. You don't poke their eye out. Sometimes they had ways in which you could buy that off as well for an offering. So chapter 25, then, the Jubilee year, Sabbath year, every 7th year they were to let the land lie fallow. Every 50th year you would get the land back. Now in the cities with houses it didn't work that way, but if you had a farm, then you would get it back. So let's pretend that in 1954, our family, the Trapp family, lived on a farm. And Grandpa Trapp made some bad investments and went broke. And he sells the use of our farm between 1954 and 2000 to Tomaszewski's across the way. Okay? In 2000, it comes back to our family, because all you sell is the use of the land for a certain number of years. You don't actually sell the land. In the cities, if you had to sell a house, you could reclaim it in 1 year and get it back. Otherwise, it belonged to the new people. But the farmland was to stay with each of the tribes. Now, so you would sell, you would get from the Tomaszewskis, you get 46 years worth of crops, the money for that. But let's say that Grandpa made a bad deal in 1948. Then you only sell 2 years worth, because in 1950 you get to your 50th year to the year Jubilee. All right, so actually if you really wanted to be broke early, so you get a whole bunch of money and then hope somehow your family can survive. But because if you got close to the end, nobody wanted to buy it because they weren't going to get much out of that and they'd have to give it up anyway. But anyway, that's how they would do that. Slaves could be redeemed. So often it's probably not like what we think of with either the African-American slaves or even what went on in Rome. A lot of these were people where they had a couple bad years, and they had to get some money and try and get back on their feet again. And so probably be a little bit more like what might have happened during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where people lost their farms and they had to go find something else and try and get going again. So no idols or images. This is the last chapter. Follow the statutes, and the land will yield well. Peace from your enemies and wild animals. God says, I'm giving you this, and it will all go well for you. 26 is a very, very interesting chapter, because it says, you do it and it'll go well. That's that if-then within the relationship. It's ontological. You do this and everything will go well. But if you depart from the statutes, there will be terror, wasting, enemies will come, they will rule you, they will terrorize you, wild animals will come, the sword will come, they'll eat your children. And then, if you acknowledge this and confess your sin, I will forgive your iniquity. So, somewhere along the line, if you say, I guess we went away from God, then he will hear that, and he will look for you to change your ways. But this is it gets worse and worse. It's sort of like when we used to go through Chicago, and the 3 kids were in the back seat. I would simply say we're in stage 4 right now. I don't want any screaming, yelling, poking, fighting, talking. We're not at stage 1 or 2 or 3 where I've got to yell again like, it's supper time, it's supper, Mom's got the food on the table, get your hands washed and get up here. We're at stage 4 with my quiet voice. The quietest it ever was in the car was coming up from Kansas City one Thanksgiving when it was sleeting. And from about Ames north, you didn't want to stay on the road, you didn't want to get off the road. And the kids were all just perfectly quiet. They just all knew, let him drive. And thank the good Lord we got into Minnesota, and they were putting salt on the roads, and we got home. I had to be starting a new quarter the next day, and I was told, we're starting. Students are here, so get here. The next time I probably would have said, I'm not going to risk my family's life on it. But so anyway, God does warn them. You get this here in Leviticus 26, and then you get something similar in Deuteronomy 27 and 28 that we'll see in a couple of weeks. So the last chapter, kind of an addendum on making vows. And Paul talks about making a vow that he is redeeming him or some people for a vow, and the vow that he had made. And basically there are punishments if you don't complete it, but basically it would be, I promise God I will do this. So like Hannah said that she will give Samuel to the Lord if she can have a child. And then she has 4 or 5 children more after that. But it's, if you do this, then this is what I will do. That's kind of a strange part of this whole thing, but it says in that relationship then that there were those who would talk to God about how they would respond if a blessing came to them. Okay, we'll take a break, and then we'll get into Numbers, the first half of Numbers.
We got the ontology.
Okay. Teleology, these are both what we talk about in terms of what motivation do we have for doing something. All right? In our workaday world, we do the work, then we get the pay. We quit coming to work, they fire us. That's teleology on both sides, reward and punishment.
Okay.
We are in the center of being expected to do something. So I can read the Bible as a teleological document. In other words, I can read it that way and say, here are God's rules. In fact, I think maybe New English Bible does this in some of the New Testament books. Like if you would get to the book of James, it might have the title God's Rules in there, which sounds like a teleological thing. Now you're saved, now here's what God expects you to do, wants you to do, what you should do, what you're supposed to do, what you ought to do, what you better do. And thus, there are people who will read the whole Bible, or at least the New Testament, and say, what do we have to do so that God will love us? And that puts me in the center of the story then. I do something and God responds. Now, the second commandment, the second word that says, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall not take the power of the Lord your God for your own empty purposes. So if I say something like, I'm going to be the best person I can be, and God will have to bless me. Or I'm going to tithe, and then God has to bless me because of the way I read certain passages. That would be a teleological thing from the word telos, which means something far away that's a goal. So a telos could be a telescope, it could be a television, it could be a telephone, where something's happening a long way away, and I'm trying to affect something there. Ontology comes from the Greek word ontos, which is the feminine participle of the indicative verb, on ontos on, which means being. So beingness, what is I now? And what does it mean of what I is, what I be, what I am, what I are, whatever kind of word you want to put with that. And so the one says I'm already in a relationship, and these are the things to stay away from. So if I yell at a child, is that okay? For what reason? Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Trapp. You would not yell at a child running out into the middle of the street to get a ball? You wouldn't. You wouldn't yell at a child who was going to put his hand on the stove.
There's the teacher's voice and then there's yelling. That's different.
Well, I'm talking about at home as well. If you see someone where a car is coming and they're running out in the street, you might yell at them, okay? Now the one is yelling at someone because they've done something wrong and you're just unhappy with them. Why did you do this? So you colored outside the line. There's a different kind of yelling when it's warning about some danger that they may know or not know about. Don't eat those mushrooms. They're going to kill you. Okay? Can mushrooms kill you? Some can, yeah. There are other things that can kill you as well. So if I say, don't touch that. Our dad used to talk about hydrochloric and hydrofluoric and sulfuric acid. If there was a bottle of hydrofluoric acid in the basement for some unknown reason, and I decided that it looked like good water and I was going to drink it, and my dad yelled at me not to, that would be out of love. Okay? I'm simply saying there are some things that we're told to stay away from. All right? We did get mercury, though.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah. Oh, sweet. Yeah. You hear they closed the school down because some thermometer broke. You know, here we're at home. You know, Dale's got this nice barometer built. You know, with a 30 inches high, whatever. And a few other things that probably weren't real good for us that we didn't get warned about or that he didn't warn us about. But the encouragements to stay away from these things, some of them are don't be like the other nations. Some of them are don't be acting as if you have control over life or that you can go off on your own. And the punishment is you get kicked out, go off on your own. That's like get kicked out of the garden. You're separated from others. And so one thing just in terms of where we are right now, we have been at Mount Sinai since Exodus chapter 19. So Exodus 19 and 20 are preparatory for Moses going up on the mountain. He gets the 10 words in chapter 20. In chapters 21 to 23, he gets that covenant code, which is a lot of instructions about various things. That's one where I showed you about the one with the man who beats up his neighbor and is to care for him until he gets well, and how that gets used in the Good Samaritan story. Chapter 24, the elders, 70 elders, went up on the mountain with Moses and saw this crystal pavement, and they were in God's presence, and they ate and drank. Have you ever been there? The reverend in the back is shaking his head. Where have you been there?
Right up the rail.
every Sunday at the rail. We are welcomed in the presence of the Almighty God who feeds us with the benefits of Jesus' death and resurrection and celebrates that we are part of that new relationship, that new covenant, and sends us forth within that framework to love and serve and rejoice. Thank and praise, serve and obey. So we worship and we witness is the way we've talked about that. So we have been there. It doesn't look quite as flashy. Maybe we ought to get some strobe lights or something, some Sunday and whatever. But we are fed with the body and blood of our Lord in the presence of God. Romans says that we are before the Father's throne in the prayers of Jesus and in the prayers of the Spirit, the groans that are too deep for words. So we are always being brought before and begged for and pleaded for and loved in the presence of Almighty God at all times. Now, so that was chapter 24. Chapters 25 to 31 was the description of how the ark and all of the various utensils and the clothing for the priests and the tent hangings and everything, how all those were to be built. Moses comes down to give them that information. And chapters 32 to 34, among other things, talk about how the Israelites turned away already then, believed God had died, and decided that they would ask Aaron to build them a golden calf that would maybe be their leader to lead them wherever they were going to go, back to Egypt or into the Promised Land. Chapters 35 to 40, it talks about how they actually constructed that tabernacle and everything. Then we're still at Mount Sinai, and really not that long into it. So it's 40 days after they got there. It was 2 months to get there, 40 days while they were there, and then he goes back up the mountain. And they construct most of this. Then we get into Leviticus. Leviticus 1 to 7 is talking about part of that worship with offerings of thanksgiving to God for the gifts that he had given them. And then offerings for sin. Major 2 would be the thank offering or peace offering, which would be the I thank you, and the whole burnt offering, which would be saying, I am sorry for what I've done. And I ought to have died for it, and I plead with you not to put me to death. And an animal dies instead. There are other animals and whatever that get involved in the sin offerings and trespass offerings, which are various grades of primarily certain kinds of cultic functions is where most of those come in, where somebody didn't pay their tithe or things like that. So there were ways that in the Old Testament you'd have to say, I sinned against you, I didn't give you what you had asked me to return. That's the first 7 chapters. 8 to 10 in Leviticus are first of all about Aaron and his sons are ordained. And the interesting word, the word ordained in Hebrew means their hand was filled. So they were given the responsibilities. And they were to take care of those. And then Nadab and Abihu offer unholy fire, and they die for that. Again, we never quite know when somebody dies immediately for something that they've done, or when God, quote, gives them a pass. Adam and Eve got a pass after doing the worst that they could possibly do. They didn't die immediately. They did spiritually, but not physically. Okay, they pulled away from God immediately. Their whole life after that was lived at enmity with him in a certain sense. We really know nothing more about their life after they've had their children. But then we have 4 chapters which have various kinds of cultic purities and woman in her menstrual period and males when they were unclean and other kinds of things like this if they were burying somebody. And then chapter 16 was Yom Kippur, which kind of comes out of nowhere. You've got all these sacrifices, and then all of a sudden you've got this thing that where they would offer the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies for himself first to ask God to relieve him of his sins. Then he takes another animal in with the blood for the sins of all the people. Then the scapegoat gets chased out into the wilderness to Azazel. And then you get the holiness code that we have just looked at in 17 to 26. and the addendum with the vows in chapter 27, we're still at Mount Sinai for all of this. Remember, Exodus 1 and 2 takes about 40 years. They cry out in their bondage. Moses has to be born, grow up, kill the Egyptian, get ratted out, and flee. Then we have another 40 years before he comes back. Okay? And now we're in the third 40 years where he's leading them up into the land of promise. So they didn't really get taken out of the land until 80 years after they had started to complain. He has to grow up and then he has to become old. They're still at the mountain, and they're going to be there through about chapter 10 right now. So now they're getting ready to leave. There are some very interesting parts of the books of Moses and some that are not as interesting to people. I've often said that my favorite book in the Old Testament is Leviticus, because it is the stewardship book. How do you live your life? Don't just say, oh, live your life, but to give some framework to how God would have guided and led the people. Love your neighbor as yourself, with such things. But here, they do a census of the tribes. They have a lot of riffraff that came along as well, people from outside the tribes. But anyway, you have the 12 tribes, about 603,000, in addition to 22 or 23,000 Levites who were not enrolled with this. In chapter 2, they have a special encampment. Now, I cannot explain all this to you. I really can't. But they build the tabernacle, and they're putting that all together. But they also have a tent of meeting where Moses would go and speak with God. So Aaron is really the one who talks to God or gets wisdom from him in the tabernacle. But there's also a tent where Moses would have been. And so they have, with 3 tribes around each side, and then the Levites in the center. East around it, you have Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. South, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. West, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And north, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. Now, the only one that kind of makes sense to me is Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin to the west. Who is that? That's the Rachel tribes. The Rachel tribes. Okay, the other ones are a little bit more confused. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah are the 4 tribes that are the 4 oldest ones. So some of the tribes of the servant girls, Bilhah and Zilpah, and then some others are mixed in there at various sides, with the Levites with various families around who are going to be carrying the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle things as they go through. So you're still there. Then the lineage of Moses and Aaron, and then the count goes that there's 273 more firstborn there at that time than there are Levites. And so they pay the Levites 5 shekels for each one of them, but it's as if the Levites now become the firstborn for all the families. Otherwise, the firstborn male would have been given to worship in the temple, to leadership in the temple from every family. Instead, they simply say the Levites are going to take their place, and then the others are all, the 273 there, there's 5 shekels for each one of those. So then it gives a listing of what each of the Levites are going to be carrying. So the family of Gershon carries the screen, the courts, and the cords and everything. They live to the west. Kohath, the ark and the holiest things, they live to the south. Merari, the frames, the bars, the pillars, the bases to the north. And then Moses and Aaron live to the east, and they have direct access, Moses particularly, right into that. So for us, it's kind of weird to see all this stuff. You know, why is that in the Bible? But it was an order and an organization, and everything revolved around God giving his advice and his counsel. He would go with them, and that's the way that gets put together. Chapter 4 then talks about that the Kohathites are going to be just between the ages of 30 and 50. So you were, excuse me, I'm sorry. In fact, all of them, they were 30 when they took over. They were 50 when they retired. That's not bad. I'm going to have to turn this off a second.
Water?
Water everywhere, including some right here. Thank you. didn't want to cough into that mic too loudly. So anyway, the three, the Kohathites, the Gershonites, and the Merarites are closer in with that family of Aaron, not his sons, but others there. And then you've got the number of Levites who are there at a number of 8,580 who are between the ages of 30 and 50. Chapter 5, if you were a leper, you could not stay in the camp. If you had wronged someone, this was one of the general rules. If you had wronged someone, you restore what you wronged plus a fifth. So if I stole 10 goats, I'd have to return 12. And you're in a little bit more of a closer society where it wasn't quite as easy to get away with things. This again, the women are the ones who are in trouble here, not the men. Please don't get angry with me. It's in the Bible. I didn't write it. But if a woman was suspected by her husband of having cheated on her, he would go to the priest, and they had something called the ashes of the red heifer. And they would burn this red heifer, and they would keep the ashes, and they would stir it into water, and then she would drink it. If she had cheated on her husband, she would have all sorts of internal problems and not be able to bear children anymore. If she hadn't, and the guy just had falsely accused her, then nothing would happen. And then you just go on. I didn't write it, please.
Does it really work?
Huh?
Does it really work?
Do you know something? I'm glad you asked that question, Jerry, because I've been trying to remember a place to say this. This stuff doesn't get described hardly anywhere else. These laws don't get talked about. That is never mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament. As this woman got caught, she did it, and this is what happened. And many of these laws, these instructions, never get mentioned. We don't hear much about how they went and did peace offerings or sin offerings or guilt offerings. There are places where some of it gets mentioned, some. But most of these, it's as if nobody ever read them or acted on them. And with very rare exception about some of the consequences, like I can't think of a single case in the Old Testament where it said this guy got fined 10 goats plus 2 more. And so in many ways, it looks like an ideal. We don't know who acted on it. We don't know if anybody did. We don't know which tribes. Once every 7 years, according to the very end of Deuteronomy, they were supposed to read that, and everybody was to say, yes, this is what we agree to. But in terms of the places that we have something, there'll be a sacrifice that it says that Samuel went to David's family to have a sacrifice at a certain time, I think that at new moon or something like that. And but it won't, we really don't have much any of this ever talked about. So we know, for example, that in the time of 2 Kings, there are some lepers who are dying, and they go and they're going to give themselves over to the Syrians and then find out they've all fled. So we know that they were kicked out of the city. And we know of at least, I know of one king, Uzziah or Azariah, who had leprosy. And of course Naaman. But not to know much about most of these. I don't think there's anything about the year of the Jubilee, or the year of the Sabbath, or the seventh year when they would let the land lie fallow. It just doesn't show up. It's really strange. It's really strange. Now, by the time of Jesus, some of that is being interpreted more after they have come back from exile. And most people say that what we have here in these 5 books is a result of an editorial activity of Ezra the scribe, who also was a Levite, if I remember correctly, who kind of republished it. And how much it was used, I mean, it's a written document. Is somebody who lives in Jerusalem or Shiloh or Bethel going to be going up to Nazareth and reading that to people? How much they really knew, how much they really followed. the major sins are to make treaties with other nations and to offer sacrifices to other gods and to beat up on your fellow citizens. But the details of those, like for example, we do know that in the valley of Jezreel, where Naboth had his vineyard, that Jezebel trumps up a charge that he has cursed God and gets Naboth killed, and then says to her husband, Ahab, you can go get the land now, he's dead. So there are hints of it here and there, but not a lot. Not a lot. I'm glad you asked that question, because we really don't know. It's strange. Can't do any more than that. So, chapter 6, Nazirite vows. Not to drink wine, not to cut your face with a razor or shave. I was reading about this yesterday. I said, where'd they get their razors from?
Gillette.
Where'd they get the razors? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, by the time they're moving in is the beginning of the Iron Age. Okay, until then you've had the Bronze Age, early, middle, and late Bronze Ages. And about 1200 is when actually some Philistines probably brought in iron technology. Kathy and I were up when I did a committal after a funeral for somebody up in the Iron Range, and we went to this one mine where there's 29 steps in refining the ore until you get to the point that they put the copper pellets in the train to send them down to Pittsburgh. 29 steps. You know, it's not just like that you'd have with copper, where the copper would just kind of ooze out of the rocks that they had there when they built a fire. And so I don't know where that comes from. You could maybe use flinty stones and call the razor, you know, from a flint stone or something like that. But they would have done these as temporary vows. We don't do vows much. I guess I would say that Kathy and I make a vow when we talk about what we're going to give here to church, but nobody is chasing after us on that and taking us to court because of it, or we don't have some big celebration when it's all done. But here's where we begin to get the traveling music. Okay? Here's the blessing of Aaron. As they are leaving Mount Sinai, on their way through the wilderness to go to the land of promise. Yivareka Adonai vayishmareka. Ya'er Adonai panav eleka vihuneka. Yisa Adonai panav eleka v'yasem leka shalom. That's what they would have heard, except it wouldn't have been pronounced that way, because I've talked to Jewish people who didn't understand that. Mike's friend, Mike's Jewish lawyer friend from New York. All of a sudden I realized he was using a different system of pronunciation that they would probably use in Russia, but anyway, I finally figured out he and I were using the same words. And I think he finally said that. But what is a blessing? It is when God pretty much says, I am putting a canopy, a cover over you. A blessing is not the time when, okay, where's your purse, where's your coat, church is over, we can get out of here now. Okay? It was traveling music. It's very similar to what you see in the words in Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes, which are really a blessing as well. God says, I put over you this kind of protection and love and care. And so it really says, as you leave, this goes with you, my protection goes with you. I almost got myself in trouble just out of my ignorance when I was teaching the Psalms at the seminary. I got to teach 2 different summers down there early on. And there is a text in the Psalms that says, the Lord bless your... What's going to come next?
Going out.
You're going out and you're coming in. There's another text that says, the Lord bless your coming in and you're going out. They're both in the Psalms. The one, coming in and going out, would be, the Lord bless the time that you are here in the sanctuary. the Lord bless your going out and coming in is the 167 hours when you're not here. I kind of like that one better. It says, I go with you and I'll watch out for you, and I'll care for you, and I'll make sure that everything goes okay. But they're both blessings, and they each have their place. This really is as you are leaving. Now, if you came before a Pharaoh, you would come with your eyes toward the ground. You would very likely put your nose into the dust. And you would give him the chance to either take his heel and break your neck or tell you to rise up and look him in the face. It starts with an R, I think. Who's the king in, I want to say Rizpah, and I know that's not right. Who's the king in Damascus?
Hazael?
Before Hazael. The one who dies. I think it starts with an R. See if you can find it. It would be about 2 Kings 8 or 9, somewhere in there, I think. But anyway, Ahab, when he is fighting, he has a chance to kill off 31 enemy kings. And yet it says he welcomes him up into his chariot. And he says, let's look each other in the face. And that's when God says, look already in 1 Kings, in the Elijah story, where all three of them are mentioned.
Is it Ben-Hadad?
Huh? Ben-Hadad, yeah. Ben-Hadad. That starts with an R, doesn't it? Yes. Ben-Hadad. Rizpah's a city up there, but not the king. Yes, Ben-Hadad. And Hazael, who smothers the king to death with a wet blanket, then names his kid Ben-Hadad. Sort of like to cover up, and they didn't have CSI then, and he got away with it. So yes, Ben-Hadad. Anyway, what happens now is there will be some times where they will be blessed. Here the Lord says, I'm going to let my face shine on you. I will let my countenance be upon you. We're going to look each other in the eye. And so it's not like we directly get to do that and live. But God says, you're right in my presence and you don't have anything to fear about. I've declared you not guilty. And so the blessing really is an affirmation of forgiveness as well, and of peace with God himself. And each one of them has two parts. So bless you and keep you. So put a covering over you and keep you protected from the outside. Make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. Remember how Moses came down from the mountain and his face was shiny because he had talked with God. We had that in church, about 3 weeks ago, maybe. Be gracious to you, which is the word of forgiveness. Lift up his countenance upon you, that he lifts up his countenance to look at you as if you're the more important one, and then give you, what's that last word? What is it?
Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you very much. We got to do a little Hebrew here. So you already know hallelujah, you know amen, now you know shalom. Boy, I tell you, got 1,000 words if you know each one 333 times, right? Chapter 7, offerings. This is as boring as it gets. I'm sorry. But 12 times through, it says, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Reuben, Simeon, Gad, Ephraim, Manasseh, Benjamin, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali each gave a silver plate, a silver basin, a golden dish, a bull, a ram, a lamb, a goat, an oxen, rams, and I even put on there, etc. Other serving pieces. So they each provided 1/12 of the tools for the church, for the tabernacle, for the sanctuary, and for all the worship. But it has to do each one of them over and over. He'd give one of these, one of these, one of these, one of these. Oh, yay. After a while, I tried not to skim my eyes over some of that, but didn't always work. Then God speaks to Moses from among the ark. Chapter 9, we have the 7 eternal lamps for the lampstand inside the holy place. The Levites are washed and shaved and cleaned, and they're to serve instead of the firstborn. And the Levites, not like the actual family of Aaron, they go from age 25 to 50. And so chapter 9 then, the second Passover takes place, and the unclean celebrate it 1 month later. And then it says the cloud is going to lead you by day and the pillar of fire by night. I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but it's probably the same thing. It's probably a cloud that has a fiery inside to it that you can only see it at night. Kind of like you can only see the stars at night, even though they're out during the daytime as well, because something else is making it brighter. And the people are told when the cloud lifts, then you go. When the cloud stops, then you stay. This is in some sense a form of theophany, of an appearance of God. You might remember that in the temple, when Solomon dedicates the temple, that this cloud comes and surrounds it. You might remember that at Jesus' ascension, it says a cloud received him out of their sight. I don't really think it's the way most clouds look in most Ascension Day services, where it's just Jesus, and I think the bulletin last Sunday had the same thing, where there's a kind of a cloud that kind of looks like this, and Jesus is just kind of being lifted up. I think that and the Transfiguration, the cloud comes over, and when it leaves, he's not there. He's just not visible. It says they were looking up, where in the world did he go? And the angels say that he will come back. But clouds in the presence of God. So when Jesus has the Transfiguration and the Ascension, that's what God does. And so that kind of is an affirmation that here God is involved in that as well. Then there's some information here about the trumpets, 1 sound trumpet, 2 sounds, the trumpet pealing, and so different directions that would be given. That is something I kind of learned a little bit in the Civil War. The most important persons are the flag bearer, the guy with the flag, and the guy with the trumpet, because he gives the signals: left, right, center, retreat, advance, and whatever. And so they would do that there as well. And so the tabernacle is disassembled here, and then it says, "Arise, O Lord, scatter your enemies, and then return to this place of peace." I'm going to quit at this point. All of chapters 11 to 21 are called the murmuring traditions. And so we'll take all of them together. I think I said I would go like to chapter 18. Is that right on your sheet?
Yep.
To 18. But that's far enough for the day. I've already kept you over as usual. But we'll look at the murmuring traditions. And then there won't be too much more that I'll touch on with the end of Numbers. And then we'll have 2 days with some more legal and motivational material from Deuteronomy. So 3 more weeks to go. Thank you all very much.